She's author and co-author of several books, edited by Postal and National Geographic, and The Six Principles of Big Writer and Student Value. She's here today to speak about Redesigning ELT with the six principles. Please join me in welcoming Deborah Short.
Thank you and good morning. Oh, there we go. Okay. I'm delighted to be here. I appreciate the U.S. Embassy funding my travel from the U.S. and I got here yesterday. And it's delightful to feel the energy in the room and to see all of you. I hope you'll appreciate the talk this morning. I am going to talk about the TESOL 6 Principles Initiative. Just to show of hands, has anybody heard of it? Okay, a few of you. I have some bookmarks. So if you want a little reminder of what the 6 principles are, I have some up here and can share them today, also at my session tomorrow. Let me then begin and give you an overview of the 6 principles and tell you a little bit about why TESOL has proposed them and how they fit in with your conference. The first one, and I think what you'll see is that they are very basic statements. They're really the foundation of what exemplary English language teaching should be. First off, we want to know who our learners are, because we really can't provide very good instruction unless we know their goals and their backgrounds, their literacy levels, and their talents, even. We also want to make sure that we're creating conditions that promote language learning. Now, I think for most of you, in an English as a foreign language context or in a CLIL context, language is a main goal for all of you. But the 6 principles, of course, are to be international. So when we come and talk about the US and we talk about the physics teacher or the algebra teacher, having them put a focus on language learning is something that's a little bit new in the US. We also then, for Principle 3, want to make sure that our lessons are of high quality, that we include appropriate techniques that will promote development of the new language students are learning. Number 4 has to do with adapting materials and adapting your lessons and adapting your talk, what texts that you choose, how you differentiate. I'll talk more about that too as we go along. Number 5 is monitoring and assessing student learning. All right? We can teach and teach and teach, but if the students are not taking up any of that, if they're not getting a chance to practice, if they aren't demonstrating progress, we're talking out to outer space, basically. So we really want to make sure, informally and formally, how our students are progressing, and then make decisions that will affect our learning based on affect our teaching based on their learning. And then finally, we want to collaborate and engage in the community practice. And certainly all of you are here because you're doing that just right now. I like this graphic more when I talk about the principles, because as you can see, I have a laser pointer here. I have a machine I have to turn on somehow. See, you told me who's so good. Thank you, Giovanni. All right, what you see here in the middle, this Principle 1. And I think, really, when I think about it, this is the heart of instruction, right? This is where it should all begin, knowing who your learners are, what their goals for the language development is, what talents, what assets, what resources they bring to the classroom, and what you can do to help promote their learning should be at the heart of every lesson. What you see then around the center are the pieces that really affect lesson design. How are you going to develop this lesson? What techniques, what texts are you going to bring to bear? What activities are you going to ask students to do? What's going to promote that language learning? And when you have to make adjustments, how are you going to do that? Then are you going to assess what they've learned? If they haven't learned, if they haven't met your objectives, what do you do next? Those are the things that we want to think about. But also what I like is that the outside is where we have Principle 6. This is what's wrapping around us. How do we get better? How do we improve our instruction? Well, in many ways, it's through our networking. It's through talking with others, learning from others, bouncing ideas off people and saying, do you think this will work? Have you tried this? What's a good technique now to work with my students to promote more speaking practice, for example? So why did we develop these 6 principles at TESOL International? I think they're pretty straightforward reasons. Some of them we heard even in the morning at the opening session from the gentleman Tom, representing the British Council, and from Rodney, representing the U.S. Embassy. English is the most popular new language to learn. It is the second language or third language of more people around the world than any other language. And it's a language of business, it's a language of tourism, it's a language of study. So it's important that we get it right. That if we're going to teach students, we should do it in the best possible way. We also wanted to make sure that there would be a common understanding. Now this may not be the issue in Italy, but in the US, science sometimes is considered a dirty word right now. I don't want to go into the politics too deeply, but there is not a real appreciation necessarily for what research tells us is the best practice in a variety of domains and disciplines. However, for us as language learners, we want to make sure we're drawing on what we know from second language acquisition research. What is going to be effective when we're helping students to move from a B1 to a B2 or moving even higher? And then how is that going to help us make our decisions as we're planning our lessons or as we're designing our assessments? We also want to make sure that everybody has a common language, right? That when we're talking about instruction, we are doing it in a similar way. And then the bottom line really is to promote exemplary teaching, or as I would say, to redesign ELT. Because I think the 6 principles fit in nicely with the theme of your conference here. If we are all doing these 6 things, we're going to be providing effective instruction for our learners. Let me just tell you a little bit more about where TESOL has gotten with regard to this. We had, the first book came out about 1.5 years ago, and that was focused on K-12, primarily in the US, but with applications to most countries where English is the medium of instruction. It has in the book a lot of classroom-based examples, explanations of different techniques, vignettes for how these principles look in practice. You'll find charts, I'll show a few of them during the course of the session as well. Last March, a second book came out, and this is for adult education and workforce development. So it's what in the US we call adult ESL. It's not the professional level yet, but it's, in the case of Italy, you have a number of refugees and migrants who have come. And if you have programs for them, this is the book that will be effective for you. In particular, there's a chapter about additional responsibilities and roles that adult educators sometimes play. Things like, how do you deal with trauma? Or how do you deal with people who have learning disabilities? Or what about women that come from a culture where interacting with men is not quite an easy thing? And what are some of the steps and techniques that we can do for that? And then in March, we will have another book, which is looking at English for academic purposes and other specific purposes. So I know that many of you were working at, I think you call them, do you call them IEPs here? You know, where it's an intensive English program for preparation for university study, or you have courses where there's English as a medium of instruction at the university. And this particular book will speak to that in more detail. We also have a couple of quick guides. One is a generic quick guide, which is just all information about the principles. The other one is more for volunteers or para-educators. So if you have some programs where you have people who are not trained as teachers, but they need some guidance, it's a 6-page, 8 by 11 kind of booklet that gives some tips for working with learners who are, that are tied to the 6 principles. Okay, so enough of the, the sort of commercial presentation piece. Let me talk to you more about this. What is the vision? So this is the vision, obviously, that we'll all be implementing these 6 principles to a high degree. And it taps into a vision that TESOL had back in 1997 when they wrote the first standards for English as a second language that were highly used in the US. And that's that knowledge of more than one language and culture is advantageous for all students. We firmly believe this. I believe everybody in this room believes this. It would be unusual in Europe in particular not to think that bilingualism or in fact multilingualism is a bad thing. Indeed, we all know that there are major benefits for being multilingual. We also, some of you may be familiar with the action agenda that TESOL put out 2 years ago, looking at the future of the TESOL profession. It was the summit for the future of the TESOL profession was held in Athens, in Greece, back in 2017. And it really looked at what do we do as educators? How can we be more active in our profession, more advocates for ourselves, making sure things like you don't have to be a native speaker to be a teacher of English, you have to be a proficient teacher of English. And other kinds of things that we are promoting more common understanding of what's best for us as educators. With regard to redesigning English language teaching, these are some of the key things that we feel are very important. One is that the curricula are going to be relevant for our learners. We don't want to just have off-the-shelf traditional kinds of curricula that don't speak to the ways that our learners are using English today. We also want to make sure that as specialists we are recognized. And I have to ask, is anyone here in the room working in what we would call the public schools of Italy? Okay. Yeah, okay, a lot of you, most of you? Okay. So are you recognized as an expert for language development? Do you feel that you're... Okay, well, I'm sorry. I was hoping that maybe here it would be a little bit different than it is in the States. But this is really important because we do have expertise. And as more of our schools are adding more English in the classrooms or they are looking at CLIL situations, we should really be the people who are tapped for helping to understand what is the best way to promote second language learning. The other piece is really a little bit related to what I said earlier. Our policies as well as our programs should be designed with research in mind. That we have evidence that what we're planning to do actually works. That it leads not only to teacher satisfaction, which is always a really good thing, but to learner success. We want to make sure our students achieve. And then we also have a vision, and I think this probably there isn't a statement here that you would not agree with, but I think it's nice to have it out there, right? To say this is what we believe. We believe that all of our students should feel respected and affirmed for their home languages and their cultures. And we believe that multilingualism and diversity are things that are valuable, that we celebrate them. And we believe that policies should support individual language rights. Individual language rights. And we want our students to be global citizens, don't we? Absolutely, absolutely. All right, so what do we know about second language development? This is one thing that we've included in the book. It's not a tomb, it's not full of a lot of arcane research studies and statistical information, but it's really telling you as a teacher, what should you know about second language learning so you can write the best lessons possible, so that you can assess your students and really understand what's impacting them and where maybe they're making great progress, but where are they perhaps plateauing out. I have a little cartoon to talk about this particular chapter for you. And I know sometimes cartoon humor doesn't translate, but hopefully you'll get this one. So this is a Dennis the Menace, which is a very common cartoon in the US. And he says, you gotta use baby talk, Joey. He doesn't speak English yet. Don't you love his sociocultural awareness here? Absolutely. Okay, so what can you find in this particular chapter? We really try to give some basic information, particularly looking at academic language proficiency, and what are those characteristics, what are levels of English language proficiency. In the first book, the K-12 book, it does have, as I said, more of a US focus. But in the adult education book, we're talking about the benchmarks that you have here in Europe from the European frame of reference. We talk about Canadian benchmarks, Australian benchmarks, and all of those kinds of different levels that one approaches your language development around. We also talk about conditions for second language learning. I'll go into that in a little more detail. And then, can I just call your attention to this last word here, dynamic bilingualism? I love that term. Andrea Hellman coined, or at least used that term for us in this book. In the US, we have all these different names, right? English learner, English language learner, limited English proficient. We have a fairly new one called emerging bilinguals, dynamic bilinguals. Isn't that terrific? Because it gets that sense of energy. It's showing that you are using the language and you have some agency over which language you use and when you use it and how you are more dynamic with it. So if you take nothing away from this talk, take away that phrase, dynamic bilingualism. Okay, what are characteristics of academic language? Who in this room works with academic language to some extent? I'm sure most of us do in some ways, right? Even if it's just to help our students read. Do they read newspapers anymore? Read newspapers. But you think about it, right? Socially, you might have a young learner who says something, oh, the sun gives us food. Well, it sort of does, it sort of doesn't, right? But we might get a little more academic with it. The plant makes food from sunlight, right? You can see that change from one to the other. But then we might see the plant uses the process of photosynthesis to make food, which is more academic, what we might see in some of our textbooks. And then we can even get to something a little more sophisticated. Plant converts sunlight to sugar through photosynthesis. The sugars make energy through cellular respiration. Okay, how many you understand all those words and all those scientific processes? Maybe not, but then you can delve into them. What is photosynthesis? How does it really work? What is cellular respiration? Is it similar to the cellular respiration we have in our own bodies? Well, yes, it is. But those are the kinds of things that we can build out from our academic English here. I want you to think about this before I give you the answers, because as a teacher, I always have the right answers, don't I? What makes learning a new language or an additional language possible? And if you were to create in a favorable environment, okay, in your ideal world, in your ideal classroom, what conditions would you create? So turn and talk to a partner about that. Next year. This is a topic. Create your ideal classroom. Let's do an action plan. This is so many. What I'd like you to do is hold on to your ideas and see whether or not you talked about some of these things. What are the conditions? So one of the things that we thought was important to identify what's essential and then what's beneficial. And then I'm going to ask you in a minute which ones you have some control over. But what's essential is motivation. That you are not going to learn a new language unless you have some type of motivation. Hopefully it's positive motivation. Then you're also not going to learn a new language if you don't have facilitative emotions, right? If you're really stressed out, you've been traumatized, you're hungry, you live in poverty, there's different things that can really affect you and so that you're not ready, you're not open to learning a new language. But if you have usable input and feedback, That's going to help you. That is essential to learning that new language. And then here's the other thing. It's not just practice. It's deliberative practice. It means that it's planned, that it's focused, that there's a reason behind that practice. That's what's essential to really learning. You can have intermittent connections and practices, and you'll learn some. But if you're going to learn well, deliberative practice makes a difference. What's beneficial? Well, whether or not the first language is related to the language that's being learned. It's easier if you are an Italian speaker. Anybody in the room speak Italian? Is it easy to learn Spanish? Yes. Is it easy to learn Mandarin? Not so much, right? Because it's not that similar. Even Hungarian, not too far away geographically, but a very different language. The first language skills. If your students are literate in their first language, that will help them immensely learning a new language. High quality instruction. Has anyone ever been in a classroom where the instruction was not high quality? Yeah? How well did you learn? If you were really motivated, right? If you really practiced, maybe you did. If you weren't, no, it's not going to make a difference for you. Avid reading, because you are engaging with the language through that reading is going to be very beneficial. Cultural knowledge, obviously. Prior foreign language learning, if you're on your third language or your fourth language, you've got it down in many ways. You've got those strategic methods of learning a new language. Having purpose and frequent opportunities, and having access to competent users of that new language. What's challenging, though, when we're learning a new language? Well, it may be that you have those socio-emotional factors that sort of ties into what makes it essential. You may have had limited formal schooling. Are any of you working with adults who have had limited formal schooling? Maybe they're refugees, for example. Not too common here. Okay, it is common in a number of other countries, right? If the learners have special needs, if they have learning disabilities, they can certainly learn a new language, but you may have different approaches that you take with those students. And if they're older learners, that sometimes can have an impact as well. So of these, which ones do you have control over?
Essential.
Well, I would argue that the ones with the check marks are some things that you have some control over, right? You cannot necessarily stop any trauma someone has felt, but you can perhaps help ameliorate it, but you don't have a lot of control. You do have control over the instruction, whether or not you're encouraging avid reading, whether you provide opportunities that are frequent for the students to use it, whether you plan for deliberative practice, and certainly whether your feedback and your input are usable, right? Obviously, those are the things that we have some control over, and those are the things that the 6 principles are trying to promote. So just to reinforce the key, what's the key term I'd like you to remember? Right. Because one of the key things too about language is that it affects our identity, right? The more we know of a language and the culture, it can inform how we view ourselves, how we view the world, and becomes part of who we are. So we really want to think about how our first language can help us to that second language, and then we can become dynamic bilinguals. In the 3rd chapter of the book, we have the real key pieces to these 6 principles. How are we going to implement them? And I'll just take you on a quick tour of a couple of aspects for each principle here. So we'll start out with all the list of exemplary practices that you can do for these 6 principles that are illustrated in the book. I'm not going to be able to see this very well, but I'll break some of them down. The first one, knowing your learners. How do you know your learners? Do you find out information about them? Where do you get that source of information? And what do you figure out that they can bring into your classroom and raise, you can tap so that you can energize the lessons that you're doing? Well, with regard to this, what does it mean in your setting? Will anybody share with me, what's one way that you learn about your students? Okay, by talking with them is a key way. Anyone else?
The teacher who, he's tutoring the students.
Okay, so we have information from other teachers who are working with the students.
You can ask them to write about themselves.
You can ask them to write about themselves.
Mini presentations.
Have them give mini presentations about themselves, certainly. Do you do this consistently?
Yeah.
Yes, no, maybe? Okay. Here are some of the characteristics that you might want to find out about your learners. Again, depending on what their school level is, what their particular goals are. Often we can, if we're in a public school setting, we might have access to their records, see what kind of courses they've had, what their proficiency levels are because we have assessment data on them. But we don't always know what gifts and talents they might have, or what their interests might be. We may not know if their home language literacy level, particularly if they're an immigrant student to Italy, for example. We might not know a lot about their home language education. But all of this kind of information can help us choose materials that we have them read, the types of activities that we have them do. If we have young learners, obviously they often want to learn everything about English, right? Vocabulary and how to read in English, how to write in English, listening and speaking activities. Phonics lessons are very common when we're working with young learners because if they're not familiar with the sounds of English, they're working on those as well. Aviation students of aviation English, they have whole different needs, right? They're professionals. They're really focused on the vocabulary, on listening and speaking skills. You know, maybe they have to read some manuals, but what's really important is if they can talk to air traffic control, right? We really want them to be successful there. But we also want to make sure that they have problem-solving language, right? Again, very critical. But different needs depending on who our learners are. A fun way to find out about your learners is to have them just do a little foldable. Are you familiar with foldables? Right, they're just kind of a little technique. These are flaps that you would lift up. And you can ask them on a couple of categories. Who's your family? What kind of music do you like? What are your hobbies? And they can put it up and they can use photos or they can use draw pictures or whatever you might have to do and list some of the things that tells you a little bit more about them. But they can also then use those as tools to talk to partners, right? You can do a mingle to music activity in your classroom, and they're sharing who they are to somebody else, another peer, another classmate. What about principle 2? So creating conditions. Obviously, we want to have a classroom where students feel comfortable taking risks, where they are eager to work with one another, with their partners, where teachers demonstrate that they have high expectations for these learners, that they really believe that they can be successful in the classroom. And then obviously as teachers, we can do what we can to increase motivation. So again, if we know that they're interested, for example, in the Grand Prix, then maybe we have some readings or we have some video broadcasts that tap into that for some of the students. What conditions do you have control over? Do you remember? We just showed that slide a little bit earlier. So we have some control over motivation, the classroom environment, how we set it up, whether or not we promote risk-taking. I had a high school math teacher. You never wanted to ask her a question. You know, you ever have a teacher like that who just yelled at you because you didn't understand something? It's like really shut you down, right? That's not what we want for our students. And we want to have a culture of collaboration. You also talk about your theme being talking about 21st century skills and collaboration, teamwork. Those are skills that are highly valued in the 21st century. What does a good classroom look like? So obviously you have ways that they're sitting at tables or desks so they can really talk to one another. You have a variety of materials for them to read. You have charts that can help them with the language. So one of the key things that we work on, that I've worked on, is helping them understand language functions, right? Which is the purpose of language, why we're actually speaking, and then helping the students articulate those through sentence starters or through language frames. And teachers in the US put up these anchor charts where they'll just show, you know, here's the way that you can, if you don't, I'm sorry if you can't see this, but if you don't know how to understand something, here are a couple of phrases that you can use. Can you repeat that, please? What's your evidence for this? I'm confused about. Those kinds of things are reminders that would be on the walls